Well, hey, I'm Jeff Baumgartner with Light Reading. We're here in Philadelphia at the Cable Tech Expo. I'm joined by Curtis Knittle with CableLabs. Curtis, it's good to see you in person. It's been a while. So a lot of the show, we're hearing a lot more about the industry's 10G efforts and so forth, and a lot of that heads toward fiber to the premises, DOCSIS 4.0.
Yeah.
But when we talk to you, a lot of our discussion has kind of gotten into the work you're doing with coherent PON.
Yeah.
And there's like a couple of angles that you guys are taking at CableLabs with that. So I thought it'd be good to kind of get up to speed on where the kind of the where and the why on coherent
Where
PON.
and the why? Those are great questions for coherent PON, because first of all, we're talking about 100 gigabit per second per wavelength, and everybody wants to know, why do we care about 100 gig? We're just now deploying 10 gig. It's a great question, but the reality is that we always want to have tools under development for our membership. That's item number one. And the uniqueness of coherent PON in this case is that with coherent technology, it'll go 4 times farther than today's PON, or it'll split potentially 16 times higher than today's PON. So instead of a 10 gig PON or 25 gig, the ITU flavors, instead of splitting 64 to 128, maybe we split it 512. And we have 100 gigabit per second capacity to share in that case.
Because generally, you guys have been talking about taking like long haul technology and kind of grafting it into, like, is it the actual access network, or kind of where's it going to live?
That's been our general strategy for now for a couple of years. We started back in 2017 doing point-to-point coherent. We created a couple of specifications for our industry, and then held interoperability events like we usually do with our specs. And so in that case, we did 100 gig and 200 gig. And just recently, we had 200 gig point-to-point coherent optics interop event that I don't know, I think we had 6 or 7 vendors there, and it was actually quite nice. They all plugged together, and we're interoping in a matter of a day. And that's the important part, right? The interoperability, so that our operators don't get locked in.
Right. And then one thing I'm always kind of curious about with the work you're doing there, can you explain like how you see the use cases developing? Like if I'm an operator and I'm like, hey, this sounds like really good technology, like what am I actually going to use it for? What's the big use case you see emerging?
Yeah, great question. So for coherent in general, we're talking about much higher capacities, right? And a technology roadmap that goes from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 gigabits per second. So what would we use those for? One of our initial use cases for both point-to-point and coherent PON is to aggregate the traffic from the distributed access edge, right? So RPDs, RMDs, remote OLTs, each of those are capable of supplying 10 gigabits per second to whatever homes are connected downstream. So at the edge, you've got 10 gig being provided, and you've got to backhaul all of that. So there's a couple different ways you can do that. You can do that with an individual 10 gigabit Ethernet wavelength, for example. Mux them all together, split them out where the current fiber node is, and you got a link. The other way is that you use less expensive gray optics back to where the current fiber node is, and then coherent technology from the fiber node back to the hub. So that's a use case. And then finally, coherent PON turns that whole thing into basically a passive optical switch. At 100 gigabits per second. Again, all for the purpose of backhauling the distributed access.
Okay. Well, as you said, we've been talking to you about coherent PON and the efforts that have been underway at CableLabs.
Yeah.
You said interoperabilities
always
efforts
key.
have been going on and key. So then, what are kind of the next steps, right? In terms of how do you take it from? I know it's up to the suppliers and the operators to decide when that's going to happen. But in terms of like the status and next steps, where do you see it?
So right now, our coherent PON is in the middle of doing specs, developing specs. So we've got a working group, like we typically do for these sorts of things. We have approximately 16 vendors that are participants. We have 12 to 14 operators that are also participating, feeding in their own requirements for the technology. And then once we get finished with specs, that's when we would move into an interoperability event once vendors have the spec and can actually build devices for it.
Okay.
So we're still several years away from being finished with our specifications.
Right, so the road's being built towards deployment, but yeah, this is where you are. Okay.
Yeah, that's where we are today.
Great. Well, it's good to catch up with you about coherent PON, and I know we're going to be talking about it for years apparently, so I'll look forward to that.
Hopefully years, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, very good. Good to see you.
You too. Thanks, Curtis.